been shown and published. Is there anything that anyone would like to ask? And you can ask through uh, through Zoom, or you can ask on Slack, and we can answer a couple questions. Give people a few moments. Tim Swanson just asked if we had ever thought of exporting the data to a graph database or time series database to build a visualization on top of. So Tim, I personally have thought about exporting it to a graph database, but haven't taken any steps to do so. I think it's a fantastic idea. Graph databases, I have experience working with them in the past, and they certainly have some very interesting properties in terms of modeling and human interaction that you can get into with them. So if you have any ideas towards that, we would love to see them presented in the community moving forward.
Yeah, I think I've seen a few teams at Cisco do some stuff with Arango DB, and I thought the sort of time series aspect, like for playback of changes, was really awesome. So I thought that might be pretty cool.
Yeah, and there's a couple ways that when you start to look at graph databases and time series databases, like they're certainly two separate things, but when you pair them together, they give you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you read and model your data. And I think it'd be quite interesting to see both of them paired up, like maybe having something similar uh, to having the time series embedded as part of the model would be an interesting way to efficiently expose and track and expose some of the information. And what tends to happen in cloud native is that you have a series of events that occur, and those events could be log messages, they could be metrics, they could be tracing messages, and we tend to try to think of them as a generic event. And of course, you could specialize the event based upon the type of information it has. But by treating it as an event stream, then this means that you're able to stream it towards something like FluentBit, or you can stream it towards something like Prometheus in order to visualize it. And it also means you can bring the right tool to the system, so that perhaps one system does very well in terms of logging and showing off how logs work. And you look at something like Jaeger is fantastic with gathering and tracking tracing information and presenting it in one spot. And so giving that central place where you can then build other tools on top of with something that's designed specialized for that use case is definitely something I expect to see happen. We also have a comment from John Joyce. He said, Tim and I showed some use cases and would love to be interested to hear if anyone in Zoom has interested in any of those use cases or have some of their own. So, John, I can tell you for sure that the use case that we showed off in the keynote has a very strong need for the virtual L3. And to give you an example, when you're working with very large companies, and so not necessarily Anthem, but it's something that plagues most very large enterprise companies, is that the time to integrate to integrate a partner or a client, if you need to pair up some form of VPN, can be very expensive. Like, it's not uncommon for some of these types of engagements to take months, or in worst case scenario, quarters, because of the way that policy is set up, the way that policy is managed, the way you configure your change and manage your change in those systems over time. There's a lot of information to deconflict, and even with the best planning, all you need is one merger in a company to bring in their network, to throw everything in disarray and have to redo all this stuff over again with long cycles. And so having some form of a virtual L3 would allow us to abstract that kind of relationship, gives a very a clean contract. And the reason that I think NSM really shines in this particular scenario is because we've taken things that were historically global, like you take an IP range and or a cedar, a set of cedars. And instead of saying these things must be global, we can never conflict with them, and we have to track these things from at a global level, then this allows us to get away uh, from keeping those things in track in that specific way, and instead allows us to localize those problems. And so we can say, "Have is my current workload and your current workload that we're talking about, is there any, can we find anything where it just doesn't conflict between the two of us? We don't have to worry about the rest of the world." And in fact, I actually expect link local addresses to be very useful here. And for those who are unfamiliar with link local addresses, you can think of them as addresses that are designed for point-to-point connections. They're actually specified in an RFC alongside with the private networks as their own range, and they're designed for when you plug in a system. If you don't have DHCP and you see a 169 address pop up, that is usually a link local address. And so these things are considered to be non-routable on the internet, but they're perfectly fine to use in a point-to-point connection. And when you're only dealing with workload to workload, then they tend to they you're able to reuse them and not worry about that conflict. So, in short, yes, there is a strong use case for the interdomain use case between multiple companies, coupled with the work that Daniel showed earlier with the interdomain, and I believe that'll be a very powerful feature for many.
Yeah, I recognized right away that the anthem fit into that. And it's kind of interesting. I was just about to ask you, well, don't you see the federated SPIFFE work being key to that too? So you kind of beat me to it there. So that's why I had so many questions about the federated SPIFFE, because it seems like it's like hand in glove kind of functionality you need for that use case.
Absolutely, and take it a step further. When you mix in, we didn't talk about policy recently, but when you add in policy, the policy can be declarative and it can be based not on the. I mean, you could base them on IP addresses, but we have a higher level thing that we can bind against. We can bind against SPIFFE identities, and so this means that we can actually look at these identities and say, is this identity allowed to connect to this secure corporate internet? And it doesn't matter what IP addresses get assigned, because we're able to identify the workload programmatically. And this ends up eliminating a lot of issues where, like, when you start to do these things, like create your network access control lists, then you tend to have to put the IP in port, and you have to keep very close track as to what's being assigned where, and how does this change over time. And in fact, it can actually be very scary to deprovision a firewall rule, that an allow rule, because if it's not uncommon for developers to say, "Oh, this thing's open. I don't need to put in a change request." So now you have a hidden link there that wasn't reported because it just worked and they had that path available. And so in this scenario, we could actually create policy that is declarative, that says this workload can communicate to that workload in this specific way. And that means when you deprovision an application or deprovision a feature in an application, you remove that from your policy, but your policy for each application is rendered for that application. So you can change things without worrying how you're going to interfere with other applications. So when you bind against these three things together with NSM virtual L3 coupled with identity and policy, you have something that's very powerful that allows you to control your network, not just from an L3 and L4 level, but L7 with policy, to say like what type of HTTP messages or gRPC messages are allowed to be put down, and drive that all the way down to L1, where you could even have a policy that says this particular thing must have this certain TPM module that outputted this particular type of information we can verify, so we know that only our systems have made it onto the are making it onto the network, things that we have personally vetted ourselves through our supply chain. So it allows us to create like an identity cube effectively that covers L2, L3 across the organization and up and down the stack. So
Yeah, and I think I think Fabio is probably going to touch on some of that same policy talk, right in the next few minutes here. But yeah, I see
Fantastic.
it. Yeah, I see it all coming together.